Welcome back to the Flagship studio. I'm Christine Heenan, executive partner at Flagship, and I am joined today by three of our CEOs to talk about halting the trajectory of disease through preemptive health and medicine. Lots of talk about different disease areas here at JPM this week, whether it's obesity, CNS, I&I. But if we went about 40 miles north to Silicon Valley, there is an obsession with staying healthy and living longer. We call that preemptive health and medicine, and we've brought together the expertise of two of our physician CEOs and a panel that has vaccine expertise from developing and distributing vaccines, bringing them to market, regulating and approving vaccines, and making sure they got in arms during COVID-19. So we could talk about vaccines as one important example of preemptive health and medicine, but there is so much more to it, and Newbar's letter about polyintelligence is bringing to light whole new ways to think about preemption and staying healthy longer. I'm going to start with you, Raj, because in addition to being a senior partner at Flagship Pioneering, you're also the head of our preemptive health and medicine initiative. What brought you to Flagship, and how your journey from bringing health to some of the most remote parts of the world, your time in government and philanthropy, what brings you to Flagship, and what's the promise you see in this initiative?
Well, before I got to Flagship, I was a physician and a community healthcare entrepreneur, and then my most recent role was at the National Security Council and at the White House. And what I've realized, whether it's working in the clinic or in the Situation Room, is the most important victories in health have been when we avoid suffering altogether. And that's why I came to Flagship Pioneering, because in addition to creating fabulous medicine companies that treat illness, we're very serious about predicting and preempting disease itself. And it's what we call preemptive health and medicine. The mission's quite simple. It's to protect, maintain, and improve people's health before they get sick.
Say that one more time. To protect?
To protect, to maintain, and improve people's health before they get sick.
Before they get sick, I got it.
And that's important because when I was practicing and seeing patients, there was a universal experience I observed when a patient or their family members received a devastating diagnosis. And that is this question: what if they could have caught it earlier? Mm-hmm. And if we were to think about our loved ones who've fallen sick, we're often asking questions like, what if we could have caught her cancer earlier? Might she have lived longer? Might she have suffered less? What if we could have known that he had the risk factors for heart disease and prevented his heart attack if we had intervened earlier? And that's what is fundamentally at the essence of the idea of protecting, maintaining, and improving people's health before they get sick, and why Flagship has worked to take its hallmark company creation activity and create companies in the preemptive health and medicine space. I'll say one last thing, which is, folks often ask, how do you define preemptive health and medicine when it comes to company creation? We really think about two types of approaches. One is predicting and detecting disease. So here, and I know we'll talk about this today in the context of cancer, is detecting disease at the earliest stage with diagnostics, potentially with sensors as well, and looking for novel biomarkers, new validated targets that might help us predict disease, detect it at an earlier stage by studying the molecular functions of our cells, and then making sure we're detecting and intervening. The second piece is preemption. And here we're working on vaccines, which will be another aspect we'll get into today. Medicines that could work earlier. If you think about what metformin's done to transform pre-diabetes, I'm a pre-diabetic, and that has been a particularly important thing. But also looking at lifestyle and wellness interventions, digital tools being another area. So non-drugs to be able to preempt disease.
Well, a lot there, but you mentioned cancer. And Steve, you are probably best known in the geopolitical world as the United States' former top regulator of drugs. But in the healthcare and clinical world, you're known as an oncologist who has led one of the most premier cancer centers in the world. And I know your own passion for detecting and treating cancer. You've had to deliver some of that devastating news to late-stage cancer patients and their families that Raj describes. And I know that's part of what led you to lead Harbinger Health and the idea of moving that diagnosis upstream, even to the pre-cancer level of intervention. Can you talk a little bit about Harbinger's technology?
Yeah, you bet. And as Raj was speaking about the cancer diagnosis, that's exactly where my mind went, taking care of patients and knowing that 2/3 of most solid cancer patients in the United States are diagnosed with advanced disease when it's incurable.
2/3.
2/3. It's bad for patients. It's more difficult to treat those patients. It's more morbid, so more side effects. And if you think about it from a health economic point of view, which is not the predominant way to look at it, it's multiples of X more expensive. So there's so many reasons to actually think about this. And this preemption story isn't just cancer, it's across, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, et cetera. So there's a lot there that we need to address as a nation, but as a world. So the other thing I thought of when Raj was talking was I asked all the time a couple questions when someone was diagnosed with cancer, but the most critical one was, when did this start? And we actually don't know the answer to that question. Now, we think it's years, so we think there's a latency period. And the really interesting thing about this is that I believe we all have the technologies to actually figure that out. So we believe that cancer starts very early before it's detectable on a scan. Maybe sometimes the immune system takes care of it, and maybe it doesn't and it progresses. But there are biological events that occur that change a normal cell to a cancer cell. And Harbinger's technology is that signature which actually defines the initiation of cancer.
How do you see or detect the signature?
We take a blood sample and we look for changes in DNA that relate to this. And it connects something that we've talked about for years in oncology, is the remarkable similarity between developmental biology, placenta, fetus, and the changes that occur in a cancer. One very ordered, one very disordered. So we're developing technology. We'll have a validated assay this year that will allow us to detect cancers through the blood at a very early stage. And that's,
Steve, what's the amount of blood one needs for your test, for your validated assay? Is it a big draw?
As part of our clinical studies, yes, because we're doing testing and other things, and we're banking blood. So, but as routine clinical care, probably 2 tubes of blood.
Wow.
So about 20 cc's of blood. And I laugh with people all the time. When I was an oncology fellow, if I walked in the room and said 30 years ago, we're going to draw a tube of blood and figure out if you have cancer, besides tumor markers, people would have laughed at me. Right now, it's routine to talk about DNA in the blood. So it's real, it's going to happen, and I think it's going to fundamentally change how we approach cancer. Last point is the American Cancer Society publishes its morbidity and mortality statistics around cancer. They ascribe much of the reduction in cancer mortality to screening. We only have 5 cancers that we screen for in the United States. We need to do better, and we need to do some of these really devastating cancers.
You mentioned how much more routine it's become to understand that there's DNA in the blood. The blood is a screening tool, but it's not widely reimbursed or understood as a tool that Medicare covers, that private insurance covers. I know there's a bill in Washington to change that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's an MCED called MCED bill, Multi-Cancer Early Detection Bill, that was originally part of the reconciliation package, as you know, in December, but did not get included in it. But there is widespread support, bipartisan support. The Doctors Caucus in the House is very much supportive of this. And the bottom line is it would allow for not necessarily an expedited pathway from a regulatory perspective, but automatic reimbursement by Medicare if there is FDA approval of those tests. I think that's a great step. Yeah. I'd love to see it happen. It certainly would be good for cancer patients. But I think we need to align those sorts of interests across the spectrum in preemptive medicine. So how do we set up the system so that all the preemptive efforts that we're taking really work and get reimbursed? So I'll give you an example. Should we have a preventive care benefit for Medicare? It's a rhetorical question. You don't need to answer it because the answer should be yes, of course, in my opinion. But those are the sort of things we need to think about it, because reimbursement is an issue and the pathway is long, the cost is great. And the last point, sorry I'm going on about this, is Raj discussed the importance of diagnostics for preemption, critically important for identification. But really from a regulator point of view, you need a surrogate or intermediate endpoint to assess how these therapies, vaccines are working. You can't wait 20 years for a disease to manifest itself. So these are critically important. They have to be rooted in the biology.
Craig, you have had experience from your role at GSK in terms of vaccines and delivering them and developing them globally. And one of the things I think that was challenging and remains challenging, whether it's flu or COVID-19, is the ability to stay on top of variants and variations. Apriori has technology that allows us not just to chase the current variant of a vaccine, but to predict potential variants,
Indeed.
a range of potential variants, and get ahead of them.
Yes.
Can you describe that from a scientific standpoint?
For sure, and I was just going to comment on the common theme here is this core desire for all of us to be able to understand what happens next, to be able to stop something bad from happening before it ever happens. And I'm super excited. My mother is recovering now from ovarian cancer, and just to understand the type of technology available to people like her that you guys are bringing to market is just outstanding. So just a thank you for me, because all of us have this core desire to get ahead of disease together. So the idea of Apriori, and you mentioned COVID and flu, so I'll start with these two everyday examples of how we design vaccines. So ever since 1796, when we discovered how vaccines actually work, the idea is that we take a currently circulating strain or a previously circulating strain and design the vaccine based on that, because the idea is to recreate the antigen, to mimic the virus, so that we can then put a non-harmful version of that antigen into a human, and the human's natural immune response prevents further disease. Now, you take that concept and it relies on where we are currently with that virus. And when you have a rapidly mutating virus like COVID was, you see flu every year, you have rapidly mutating viruses like HIV. All of them rely on understanding where the virus will go, not exactly where it is. Because by the time you design, manufacture, approve any of these vaccines, they're already slightly out of date. So when we look at the average effectiveness of a flu vaccine, the result of that is because of our design. And so that's why we see the next wave of value is in the vaccine design itself. So at Apriori, we created a platform called Octavia. Now, what this platform does is it basically predicts the future. So the idea is that we can map viral evolution by reducing this massive infinite space of variant and mutation probabilities and reduce it to something actionable. So essentially, Octavia focuses on mutation probability. And then what we do is interrogate the virus, identify immune escape, and then design antigens to counter that escape. So we understand where immune pressure will take the virus, how then to counter that by focusing the immune response in a certain space, and then designing antigens to counter and build that immunity and that more durable immunity that we're all seeking every day right now in flu and COVID.
There's been a lot of attention and a lot of worry about the bird flu virus and strains. Is this something that you have looked at a priori, that you focused on at all?
It is. It's one of those things where I think it's kind of why the company was built in the first place, is be able to get ahead of something like bird flu, because our natural reaction is panic and neglect. So we panic when something happens, and when it's not happening, we neglect. I think in this situation, we don't have enough panic to where funding is running wild for this activity. But right now, we already have preliminary data that shows, based on the WHO recommended strain, that there will be escape, and the more human-to-human contact transmission that we see, we should see escape through the current vaccines available for this. So our preliminary data says, yes, we need to take a look at H5, and we are doing that, but we need a community of people who are really looking to get ahead of H5, because it can be quite dangerous.
And is Apriori in conversations with governments in this country and elsewhere to share your technology and know-how?
So we're in conversations. I just left one, actually. We're in conversations with both public and private partners, because we're all trying to tackle this together. And it does take the ecosystem to understand the tools and technologies that are new, that haven't necessarily been built into the regulatory environment yet, to understand how we regulate and make sure that understanding the future is a safe play, and making sure that we all, I think, have a stake and a role to play in this H5 pandemic.
You talked about a regulatory environment, about funding not yet flowing that might flow. You all have perspective and experience in the regulatory environment as well as the payer environment. When you think about this new paradigm for medicine, which is predicting and preventing a specific future as opposed to treating a current state, what are the biggest barriers you see? Whether it's patient barriers, regulatory barriers, financing barriers, delivery barriers?
So let me answer this at just why would anything change on the regulatory front now? I see this for two reasons. One is we have an unprecedented rise in healthcare cost over the last several decades. That is a pressure that it doesn't matter which administration and which government, in which part of the world you're in, you're concerned about how much money you spend in your economy on healthcare. Costs are rising. There's not been many problems in the history of the world that have been effectively addressed without leveraging technology. The good news is we're at an inflection point in two types of science and technology revolutions. On the one hand is the biotech revolution with our advances. You just heard about the kind of advances in infectious disease and oncology that Steve and Craig spoke about. Flagship's well known for that. And then the other, which Nubar spoke about in his letter this week in Polyintelligence, is in the area of in computational science, the artificial intelligence, machine learning moment. Those two present tremendous opportunity. And we saw this when I was in government working on the executive order for advancing biotechnology innovation. That downward pressure to push regulatory agencies to think in new creative ways because the costs become existential to a society, paired with the opportunity that is genuinely new, especially in the way these two revolutions are converging, creates opportunities for regulators to be creative while still maintaining the hallmarks of safety and quality to be able to streamline that regulation. And that was, in fact, a key part of the executive order that came out, was to work on how we'd streamline regulation while taking input, of course, from the private sector. And I'm sure Steve and Craig will have
I'm interested, Steve, and then Craig.
Yeah, I want to share, and I hope I can say this, your optimism associated with this, because I think we are close to a public health emergency over chronic disease. I think it's that serious. And you can add in mental health and addiction to that as well. So I think it's that important, and I think that executive order was likewise very important. And so I think the table is set for some changes that are key. Now, I'll just take the FDA. We'll put it maybe aside, the reimbursement issue for the moment. But if you think about the FDA, a great paradigm example, besides COVID vaccines, et cetera, where things were hyper-accelerated, is what we've done in oncology, or what they have done in oncology in OCE, the Oncology Center of Excellence, using the accelerated pathway. And it basically is what you just described, Raj, which is that if you can identify the disease and you have a surrogate or intermediate marker, and it is a significant public health or unmet clinical need, you can accelerate the development. And I'm imagining a world, and I think it's possible, where maybe you rely upon safety data, because you have to make sure, particularly in preemption, that something's safe. I mean, you take it like right now, vaccines, that's key. And then you have surrogate efficacy endpoints. And maybe you don't need a randomized phase 3 trial. Maybe you rely on smaller trials with a lot of internal validity and then move to real world evidence. I actually see that as a significant paradigm that can be translated from cancer into the rest of preemption. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that great article in the New England Journal a couple years ago by Eugene Braunwald on cardiovascular disease. When my dad was alive in the 60s, people of that ilk dropped dead of heart attacks, and they still do. A Framingham study identified cholesterol, hypertension, diabetes. We didn't know those were risk factors, right? I mean, it's basically the same paradigm. It took us 40 years to get a 50% reduction in cardiovascular mortality.
Wow.
It cannot take us that long in these. This is an urgent problem which needs to be solved now. And I personally feel like we need to take some more risks. Not everybody agrees, but the accelerated approval process, I think, helps us do that.
I want to ask a question on that, Craig, before I turn to you, because you mentioned optimism at the start of your answer. And one of the main sort of undercurrents at JPM this week is what a new administration is going to mean for the healthcare sector, for vaccines, but part of that subplot has been a commitment to innovation and to disruption. It sounds like you're describing an area that's ripe for disruption. The need to step in earlier, the need to create paradigms that reimburse and reward preemption detection.
Yeah, there's no question I feel like this is the case. And I am optimistic, and we'll put vaccines aside for the moment in terms of discussing that one, and I hope we don't see significant changes there. But I do feel like this is a really important area. And it's really hard to argue with Make America Healthy Again. Now, it matters how you do it. And to me, this is an essential part. Let's get the diagnostic world settled so that we can develop diagnostics in a better, more rational, less expensive way. And then let's move to this accelerated state to preempt.
Gotcha.
I'd love to see it
No,
happen.
I love the optimism, and I agree with the challenge in many ways from a regulatory perspective, and you're the regulatory expert. But there are other challenges just based on the fact that we have been operating in a sick care system versus a preventive care system. And it's a whole lot easier in our everyday lives to react to something acute that's actually already happening versus prevent something you don't know whether it will happen from happening. And your effort and your energy goes to addressing things that you feel. And that is how our system operates. And so I love the optimism and the urgency around the regulatory environment, because if you can shift that and policy shifts in this direction, as we've seen some healthcare companies reward for exercising. And so you've seen the shift possible, and you've seen the speed of the regulatory environment possible. But you also need to make sure that funding's available for preemptive care, because most of the funding goes toward and investment goes toward acute care and treating something versus preventing. So there's a funding mechanism as well that exists in the public space and the private space and the investor space to make sure that we all have that same mission in mind, and the regulatory environment can support that. And then we have to, another challenge, honestly, is around consumer confidence, and a lot of the things that and this is why Make America Healthy Again, it resonates, because the consumer confidence isn't necessarily that high. And so building vaccines that, meet the expectation and offer broad protection and keep people safe, and building diagnostics that can prevent something from ever happening, these are important for that core challenge of, even after all this innovation, someone still has to accept that innovation and access. Innovation is not innovation without access. And so we have to make sure that we can instill that consumer confidence as well, and work with our partners to do that.
May I just,
please.
you have nailed two very important issues, and I want to thank you for that. One is the trust issue, which we see broken repeatedly, and frankly, not so much folks who live in Cambridge or Austin or San Francisco, but elsewhere, and who probably, the magnitude of benefit is the greatest. And so I think that's so key. I'm so glad you all are focused on that. And the other part is, having been involved in the administration of 2 healthcare systems in the US, the incentives are on investing in diseases that you cannot cure, but where the margin associated with treatment is high. And I don't want to be cynical, but that has to change. And we have to reimburse and reward preemption.
Let me ask a question about that. I was going to ask you both about something that Raj raised, which is Newbar's letter, and this notion of polyintelligence, the intersection between nature and biology, including that within our bodies, humans, and how we interpret and imagine and behave as a result, and then compute, large compute and machines, and the way they can aid us in understanding very complex systems. When I hear you talk about trust, I think one thing that is a continued march in this space of preemption and better health is the role of the consumer in their own data. In my watch telling me how many steps. The number of people here this week who said, what's your highest day of step? A reporter asked us earlier, I had 20,000 plus steps yesterday. That was not a conversation among anyone 5 years ago. We didn't know how many steps we walked, right? People's sleep scores was a discussion at dinner last night. How do you think about individually captured and reviewed data building trust in health data overall? Do you see an opportunity there?
I personally see an opportunity in people taking agency in their own health. That's where I see. So the more people are aware, and this goes for any topic, the more educated you are and the more aware you are, the more action you can take. And I think in this space of AI, machine learning, and the idea that we can take infinite amounts of information and create an actionable deliverable from that, whether it's something you're wearing, whether it's a diagnostic you're using, or leveraging AI machine learning to, as we do, look across a vast universe of, infinite mutation probabilities, all using that information to take action and for people to own that action, because we all have to do that as individuals, and then the system and the ecosystem have to support that. So I see AI and machine learning and this idea of leveraging technology to get us all kind of off our seats and get a boost toward acting for preemptive care together.
You thought about that?
Agree completely. And yes, I have a good friend who is organizing a study in West Texas, 80+% Hispanic population. Metabolic disease is huge. Folks, many of them are on Medicaid, food stamps, et cetera. And of course, access to foods that we take for granted is not as high in that setting. So she has put together this study, CGM, so chronic glucose monitoring, rings. For the first time in these folks' lives, they're actually seeing what's happening outside of the doctor.
I believe there's something to
how
that.
the food affects it, et cetera. And she's seeing remarkable effects. And so this is not just where I live, Austin, Texas thing, where people go out and run, 10 times a day. This is like a real world thing. And we can do this on a level across the country and across the world. It will have a significant impact. So I'm incredibly optimistic, and I think it is that empowers people. For sure.
I couldn't agree with you more. When people learn of a new diagnosis, and anyone viewing out there may be able to relate to this, it is in part the science of the diagnosis, the medicine around the diagnosis. People are willing to have an expert, a physician, a nurse, a lab technician, accompany you to figuring that part out. The difficult thing internally, and this may be because I'm married to a psychologist, and she's taught me a great deal about grief and loss and how people process that. But you feel a loss of agency, and Craig brought this up. And in many ways, the intelligence, polyintelligence, artificial intelligence, bringing data. We talked about wearables. I've got one in my hand. It turns out if you take 3 kids in amusement parks, that's the best way. That's the best way to get to beat any personal record you may have set. It helps patients and people restore that agency to some degree, to get a little more control.
And with that, build trust in what they're told, right? Have the data. Yeah, that's what's so. I mean, I hadn't thought about it till this conversation, but if you think about the combination of, first of all, a virus like SARS-CoV-2 that, what, you tell me, 80–90% of those given the diagnosis, it's from a self-administered test. What's our history for that previously, right? You think about the biggest drug discussed in the last year, Wegovy, and the drugs that are self-administered, largely self-administered drugs around metabolic disease, and now these wearables that are telling us everything from how many steps at an amusement park to how well we slept the night before. How will that personal data and personal involvement in getting healthy and staying healthy allow us to transfer that to a broader trust in what data can tell us through a polyintelligent system? It's really interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you see the data yourself and you see the changes in response to what you do, that you can trust. And I think the Edelman Trust Survey has shown us that, as you know, more people are taking advantage of this, ordering their own blood tests, getting their CGMs, et cetera. That's a really good thing, and I think it will build trust. Yeah,
a sick care system puts the professionals, the providers at the center of the system. A preemptive healthcare system puts people and patients at the center of the system, and that's something we could all get behind.
It's when you think it's almost a YouTube or TED Talks, or sort of people taking certain aspects of their education into their own hands. It's elements of, I'm going to collect this data and use tools to interpret it, and then be in dialogue around data I trust. It's really interesting. I'm going to ask you both, Flagship loves the future back thinking. So you are all committed through your companies, through your initiative, to really allowing this notion of preemption to take hold, both as your companies and through partners, as Flagship increasingly expands its reach through partnerships with large pharmas and others. We're having this conversation 3 to 5 years from here at JPM. What is changed about the adoption of tools, diagnostics, therapeutics, regulatory regimes that allow us to be more healthy? You want to start, Craig?
Wow. Actually, since our platform is about predicting the future,
you're comfortable in this space.
Yeah. Well, I think, so 5 years from now, what does that world look like? I think we are not only prepared on day 100, the day 100 mission for pandemic preparedness, but we are prepared on day 0. And the reason I can say that is because if you understand where a threat is going and you can really understand its evolution, then on day 0, you understand where the virus will be by day 100. And so you've already designed a countermeasure to address that. And so there's something about our readiness for the next pandemic that I see in 5 years is embedded in the way that we think and what we do and the types of analysis and risk assessments we're doing. And then I see a real role for AI, machine learning, and leveraging all this information. It's one of the, it's one of those most important resources is information, and how we leverage that in order to create action and agency. I see that within 5 years being a real tool to advance healthcare for not only the industry, but for public partners, private partners, and consumers. Because that information that creates action and makes the world healthier for all of us. And I can see that information really helping advance innovation, but help with the acceptance of that innovation and the trust factor. I can see that happening in 5 years.
Really helpful. Steve?
Yeah.
Borrow the crystal ball from Apriori.
Yeah. Well, my crystal ball is very rusty, but we are not involved in prediction. Well, maybe we are a little bit, yeah, Harbinger. But I see a world where, in a big sense, is very similar, where AI ML allows us to develop the tools, inference engines, for example, to collect large amounts of data to actually help the clinical evidence generation, and the proof that's needed, and the regulatory process to actually do this in a much quicker fashion. Because as I mentioned before, it has to be done. From cancer, I imagine us 5 years from now diagnosing stage 0 cancer patients, and then being faced with the very good problem of deciding which one of those people to treat versus not. That's a with pancreatic cancer, stomach cancer, etc. That's a really ovarian cancer, a really great problem to have. And I imagine us rethinking disease. So the way we stage it, the way we assess it, the way we diagnose it, et cetera. And I think that's a better place for everybody.
It's incredible. Raj, you want to close us out?
Yeah, just it's so inspiring to hear both of you speak about that vision in the future. I would say it's less suffering, it's more opportunity, and one of the great opportunities we have is to create companies, and I mean this about Flagship Pioneering, but also others in the sector, to create more companies to go after those major drivers of suffering and cost in our societies. Cardiometabolic conditions, neurodegenerative and mental health disorders, cancers, and infectious diseases, especially those that are pandemic threats that have taken so many lives over the years, and shift from a place where we're waiting for people to get sick from those diseases to a place where we are avoiding entirely the experience of feeling pain and feeling discomfort and feeling and experiencing disease and actually getting ahead. Health can't wait, and I think that's ultimately means going earlier and earlier. As I say, the early bird gets the worm. I think that has some wisdom in it here because people want to be able to avoid that pain and suffering, and I think there is a real opportunity to create more companies. Apriori Bio and Harbinger Health, I mean, just look at how phenomenal the leadership is of the two, are trailblazing and pioneering a whole new path for, I hope others will follow.
You know, we talked about loss of agency and loss in general earlier, late-stage diagnosis, but only now have we brought in this notion of pain and suffering that can be avoided. And what a big and important point to end on, the ability to avoid pain and suffering in people across the world. So from pioneering technologies, tools and diagnostics, initiatives, companies, we're going to blow through Make America Healthy again and keep America and the rest of the world healthy in the first place, thanks to the innovations of you three. Thank you, Craig, Steve, and Raj, for this really great discussion.
No, thanks Christine.
Thank you.